I want to say thank you to everybody that I'm on a panel with. It's so good to see young folk, and I'm going to say young folk, from Dunoon, part-time or not, engaged in their community, engaged from where they're from, and speaking about. I understand how difficult it is to be in a small community and be visible. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for speaking. It's when we start speaking, we become less frightened by each other. I also want to say thank you for welcoming me back to one of my childhood homes. I moved to Dunoon when I was 9 and left as soon as I could. Nothing to do with any of the teachers in this room, if there are any teachers who taught me. The teachers I had were wonderful, but I found Dunoon to be quite claustrophobic and quite difficult being a black and mixed race woman, where many people assumed that my father was black and my mother... It's true. See, this is why I didn't want my grandparents in the audience, and not my mother. And my mother was kind of invisibilised in this already very white community. So I don't know which biographies were provided to anybody and how much anybody knows of me or how little they know of me beyond being Dave Navarro's granddaughter. And I hope that reveal isn't too much of a surprise to some of you here. Nepotism finds its way over on a ferry and through a peninsula. The topic of a better country that we can become, I found quite broad. And far more broad than what I'm used to speaking about. So I thought I would try and reflect on what it means to be a black Scottish and mixed race woman in Scotland. And by black, I mean of African Caribbean descent, because that's something that gets lost quite a lot in terminology that we've clumped together. And that's a very important facet that I'll turn back to. I'm also going to touch a little bit upon my work within the media and organising inside and outside of a trade union and how that intersects with other aspects of my personal and professional life. I've gone down a sort of non-traditional route towards journalism and now find myself working for The Ferret. I don't know how many of you know who or what that is, but we are an investigative journalism platform. We're a co-op, so we're owned by our members or owned by our subscribers, and no one involved with The Ferret is a member of a political party, and that's myself included. We take a lot of pride in that. So any of you people that write stuff on Facebook and say that we're biased towards SNP or towards Labour, we're really not. We try hard to provide non-partisan news. That's what we pride ourselves on in Scotland. We also have Scotland's first fact-checking service, just to make sure that people are aware of what's fake, what's in between, and that comes from any public claims made by politicians, by anybody in the media, or anything that anybody suggests. 2 events took place in a short space of time, and I'm sure none of you really need reminding of what those were. But I like to be clear, and in 2014, as you know, we had the Scottish independence referendum, followed by the EU membership referendum in 2016. And regardless of which ideology you aligned with, notions of nationhood, home in Scotland, were shaken up forever. It's completely changed the landscape that we live in. It completely changes how we identify. Scottish identity, for the first time in quite some time, became of public, political and policy interest, as did what it meant to be, or as did what it means to be Scottish within Scotland, within the UK, within Europe and worldwide. As a member of the frequently overlooked population of people of colour in Scotland, my claims to Scottish identity often spark othering responses. And we get a lot of the questions of where you're really from, even though I sound like this. And this is something, that... and, it happens a lot. And that's to make people feel comfortable, that once they figure that I'm not really of Scotland, that makes people feel a little bit more comfortable. But these questions remind me that I may be here and of here, but I'm not really of here. Scotland itself has a complex relationship with colonialism, with many feeling that Scotland is a victim of colonialism, and has been used for the extraction of profit by a colonial master. But Scotland has also been historically a colonial master in its own right and has profited from this. Many of the beautiful buildings and assets that exist in our cities and the huge rural estates are owned by wealthy families and survive and continue to survive as daily reminders of the money that Scotland's elites made from slavery and colonialism. Opening up Scotland's constitutional questions invites us to revisit our history and understand that Scotland was not only responsible, but that it benefits from colonial crimes and continues to benefit people like us that live in this country. I'm not a huge fan of constantly referring to colonialism. There's limits to this analysis, I feel, and focusing on Scotland's history in the slave trade does very little to position Black Scots on an equal footing with their white counterparts. And it can be very limiting to the identities and aspirations of Black Scots, Afro-Scots, however we're choosing to identify now, many of whom have personal histories that have nothing to do with the legacies of slavery. One example is the people who arrived to Glasgow's Red Road Flats, who sought asylum in the early part of this century, and they have histories that are not as much intertwined with slavery, but the more recent crimes of the British state, such as imperial invasions and extracting resources from impoverished countries. Try saying that. Sorry, mine's not very cheery. I'll try and see if I can fit in a joke somewhere. But on that point, many of us here may agree that an independent Scotland could and should be a demilitarised Scotland. Abolition of nuclear weapons has formed a key part of our discussions around independence, but we need to ensure that we stick to our principles when we're looking at that, and not just for political purposes. We are very aware that weapons are made in Scotland today, and weapon fairs are being supported by our councils in Glasgow. People make Glasgow, as do weapons. And that can be used tomorrow to advance the UK's foreign policy at the expense of brown and black lives in countries that our media tend to ignore or misrepresent. The Black British experience tends to exclude the lives of Black Scottish people. The focus often concentrated on being black in England. I'm sure that sounds familiar to many of you living here and in this room. Many of us here understand that we may be British, but the British experience rarely recognises the nuances of being Scottish and living in Scotland. In Scotland, we often turn a blind eye to our own hostilities towards the other. We say that we cannot be the ones which other others because we've been othered. We live in the shadow of not as we have a progressive outlook. Even in Dunoon, we live with a shadow cast by a Jim Crow monument, which I'm well aware that Stephen Lawrence's father came and made a comment about quite recently. I feel that we find it quite difficult to accept critique without feeling that we're being criticised. Our politics are often wrapped up in party colours and partisan motives. Scotland welcomes refugees, but turns a blind eye to the lack of brown and black voices and faces in our public spheres. And what happens to these non-white Scots who move from refugee status to becoming Scottish? They're faced with the same racialisation as I am, the same discrimination that people from travelling communities receive, and the same marginalisation that many of us face or will face at some point throughout the course of our lives. The Scottish Government policy at the moment often clumps together, and it's called protected characteristics, and that puts together everything into equalities, which covers women, race, people from LGBTQIA communities, those living with disabilities, amongst others. This means that these groups are often left looking to access the same funding pot, and there's little in the way of understanding that you can be a black person living with disabilities and also belong to an LGBTQIA community. Policy is then further compounded by the fact that ethnic groups are clumped together into BAME, which black and minority ethnic, a language which has historically helped raise issues which marginalised groups have faced, but again, doesn't look at the nuances. My experience has been that feminism in Scotland has kind of gone down that road as well, that it doesn't tend to look at women of colour and black women within feminism. But that's a different conversation. So needless to say, I find a lot of my work is centred on equality from the perspective of a black, Scottish, mixed race woman, and that's important too. I've lived as a person that comes from both a black and white household that's in a predominantly white country. I use these opportunities about the realities of our own hostile environments here in Scotland and attempt to position voices and experiences which reflect these realities. Just referring back to the blindness that Scotland chooses to have and how that fits into like a narrative of exceptionalism. Just this year, I was part of formed a collective for black women in Scotland, and we exhibited throughout Glasgow International. And it was held at the Govan Hill Baths, and it featured 4 black Scottish women who identified as such, an artist, and this was the first in Scotland. And the national newspaper chose to interview another group of people of colour from London who were exhibiting as part of the art festival, who were talking and highlighting the same issues of racism, privilege, systems of oppression that we've been trying to bring to the forefront of public life for quite some time. But it suits us within Scotland, I think, to make visible or not make visible and not see black voices which are trying to say what could make Scotland a better country. And it is difficult when you are visible, very visible, in a land that also sees you as invisible, to speak out and be the person that does it. And media representation. I need to speak about media because that's where I'm involved in with the Ferret. I'm part of the National Union of Journalists and I sit on their National Executive Council and Scottish Executive Council. And the union isn't without its difficulties. And yeah, a union that represents people that write unfair things and misrepresent people is quite a difficult union to be in. The media affects how people are seen and how we see ourselves. And if you're working class and if you're undocumented and if you're seeking status and if you're living with a disability, hidden or visible, if you're LGBTQIA and or black, you're unlikely to get balanced coverage of your community, and you're also unlikely to know how to challenge unfair representation. If we look at how people are portrayed by the majority of the media, it makes clear that we are still seen, and most of us are still seen and discussed as something other. And that's if we make it into pages at all. I've been following quite a lot of discussions within the industry around the Grenfell fire and comparing it to the Glasgow School of Art fire, where one was a huge loss of life and one has been depicted as, a huge loss of culture. With the Grenfell fire, I've been listening and hearing that this is a real-life impact of a disappearing local news source, that no one was there to pick up the story. We know that this might well be the case, but residents had voiced concerns over housing and social policy, over concerns and safety, over their homes, and concerns which were hugely, hugely ignored by the media and which suddenly became newsworthy through a tragedy. We need, and I hope that Scotland can have a media where stories that have complex issues like housing and inequality, class and race covered in its mainstream media. And the media reaction to Grenfell was shocking because those that are often invisible, and in this case it was poor people and brown and black people living in one of the richest boroughs in London, they were made visible through a tragedy, and that's only when a media platform was provided and offered to them to talk. Mainstream press was sympathetic for a time, as is to be expected, but that quickly subsided when angry people who had questions, stormed local council offices, and blame quickly looked past governments and issues around regulations and looked past all the warnings. And it was quickly shifted and put onto one person whose home that the fire had started. And he was depicted as a reckless human being and became the scapegoat. Another example here is deaths in custody. And since 1990, there have been 1,061 deaths in custody. And a disproportionate amount of these deaths are of black people and people of colour in restraint-related deaths, but these stories still don't make the papers. Scotland's current narrative insists upon its exceptionalism, and that's gently guided by an emphasis on citizenship and not ethnicity. But by recognising the attitudes which exist in our society, which allowed the death of Sheikh Ubao in police custody and the death of an unnamed detainee at our own detention centre in Dungavel, that these mirror those attitudes of the British government. And that's where Scotland could be exceptional, by speaking out about these. Sheikh was killed in police custody in 2015, for those of you that don't know, in Scotland. In Scotland, with its comparatively smaller population of black people, in a town with a population of just under 50,000 people. The media here represented and replicated the exact same methods and techniques that media in England does when it's referring to issues around black deaths in custody. At first, he was depicted as wielding a machete. Next, it was a knife, then a blade. A policewoman had been stabbed. Next, she'd not been, but had been hospitalised nonetheless. Over the weeks, different accounts emerged. After being beaten with batons and sprayed with CS spray and pepper spray, he was taken to hospital still in handcuffs, where he died. And pathologists were told that the use of sprays known to have caused death in a number of other cases known to cause death in a number of other cases. A post-mortem report failed to mention that these had been used at all. So the stories and experiences of issues that we live with, and and there's quite a convenient break, a bit of light-hearted interjection. But speaking about race and speaking about blackness and speaking about whiteness is uncomfortable. I don't proclaim to be the person who speaks for every single black person in Scotland. I never expected to be the person fighting for race equality and doing a lot of anti-racism work and equality work. But a better Scotland needs to provide an accurate representation of the lives of people who live them. Why don't we challenge those stories? Why don't we feel that we deserve a better media? Why don't we feel that we deserve to know what lies behind harmful decision-making? Don't we deserve a media which has no agenda except providing non-biased information in the public interest? Don't we feel that we deserve to create a Scotland that does recognise all these issues, all these secrets and difficult things that we don't want to speak about, and have these conversations, that it doesn't become an awkward brown person sitting at the end of a table having to speak about these issues? BBC got in contact with me yesterday, I think it was, asking if I could provide a comment around Sir Alan Sugar's racist tweet. And I couldn't, I was busy. And I listened to a bit of it, and they had a black woman and a white man saying this is racist and this isn't racist. And similarly, when they've asked me to help them with research, they've asked if I can find them women who are singing in a choir, which is a stereotype in case you don't know, and that's black women, and a gospel choir, and young black people playing sports. And I've been having very long conversations, very hard conversations with them. But a lot of this comes from us as well. If we see things in the press, when we see that people are being treated unfairly, there's been a huge backlash against sexual assault through the Me Too campaign, which was started by a black woman in America, which not a lot of people know. But we should be doing the same thing with our media in our day-to-day. Language is important, as we've heard. Language helps us feel as if we're part of a community. Language gives us the tools to explain to other people how we feel about things. But at the same time, just because language changes, it doesn't necessarily change the deep-rooted structures of inequality and oppression and discrimination that all of us, most of us, some of us will know of or experience at some point in our lives. And I think I'm going to stop there because I think I've gone way over 20.